Check out today's piece of fan art. It's another servant design, this time featuring the Les Mis characters Valjean as a ruler and Javert as an avenger. We've featured this artist's work once before, and I'm definitely seeing an improvement. Cleaner lines and smoother coloring. Keep up the work, and thank you again, Kigai Okasu. Welcome back to OtakuDaiKun. Dai here. So I feel it's time we had a discussion about multiverses in fiction and what role they play for fans of different stories. You see, even in fiction, it's possible for fans to feel cheated by how events play out. For instance, we generally view something like a Deus Ex Machina as a sign of lazy storytelling because it wraps up the conflict in a nice little bow, undoing the dread and consequences that we experienced prior. Characters who are shown as dead may suddenly come back to life once the big bad guy is defeated. You know, that sort of thing. While we can certainly appreciate a happy ending, the way the ending is achieved is important, and we often feel cheated when we wind up mourning a character's death, only to find out they either weren't dead at all or were somehow resurrected. For example, Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker pulled this kind of crap twice in a single film. First, they made it seem like Chewbacca, a fan-favorite character for generations, was tragically killed when Rey lost control of her powers. Except he wasn't killed at all, and instead was aboard a different transport ship. Pfft. Then C-3PO has to give up his memories in order to decode the Sith language, and it's played up like this is a major sacrifice, only for him to regain all his memories because R2 stored a backup of his data. Maybe for a brief moment after these events occur, we might mourn these losses, but then it just comes off as trolling. Ha ha, fooled you! It's clear the storytellers are trying to invoke our emotions and make us worry. After all, character deaths usually enhance a story's sense of tension and consequence. At the same time, however, those same creators want the benefit of that character being alive, so they somehow bring them back at a later time. It's their desperate attempt to benefit from a heroic sacrifice while avoiding the consequences of doing so. We get annoyed when stories do this, retconning major emotional scenes, and yet in multiverses this is par for the course, and I don't see that same level of disdain. Why is that? To explore this, we need to properly define what a multiverse is. My own definition is intentionally broad, but it's basically any time that the presence of alternate timelines is acknowledged by either the story itself or simply by fans who experience it. We see this whenever there are different versions of the same story, or when a story deals with other possibilities within itself. The most common multiverses aren't created intentionally. Rather, they emerge naturally whenever a story is retold or reinterpreted by a different creator. For instance, look no further than Batman's various film and TV adaptations. We've got the old Adam West Batman, shark repellent spray and all, alongside the much darker Christopher Nolan trilogy. Then there's the animated TV show, and dare I mention the bat nipples? Even in the original comics themselves, we have different versions of The Dark Knight, reboots and spin-offs that vastly change the tone to match different time periods and demographics. At a point, it becomes useless to ask which of these Batmen are the real Batman. We're better off just imagining all of these versions as equally valid, relative to their own universes. This applies to fan works too. Fan art and fan fiction often include an artist's individual tastes and interpretations of a given story that differ from what the original creators intended. This is where we get the term canon from. It's a way for us to distinguish between official works and fan-derived ones. Distinguishing between canon and non-canon works in a series helps creators maintain creative control over their properties, and it also serves to put various fans on the same page. By establishing an official chronology of events in a story, viewers can all be sure they're discussing the exact same story. Going back to Star Wars, this became relevant when Disney acquired the rights to the series and declared all of the non-movie works, such as the books and games that comprise the Star Wars extended universe, to be non-canon. This allowed Disney to make their own continuation of Luke's journey without having to adhere to the developments already established by previous authors. Now, the extended universe is only considered one possible timeline for Star Wars, with another being the sequel trilogy. It doesn't even matter which one is seen as official. Fans now have to contend with more than one continuity. There's one universe where Luke discovers that a Jedi can wield both the dark and light sides of the Force without being tainted, and another where Luke loses his confidence in himself and becomes a grumpy hermit. When it comes to anime and Japanese media, we mostly see multiverses show up through visual novels, as they serve to be similar to choose-your-own-adventure stories. Whether you're trying to avoid a bad ending or follow down a certain character's exclusive plot route, visual novels allow players to experience various ways in which the same story can go down. In Fate Stay Night, for instance, Shiro can either wind up in a threesome in the woods with Rin and Saber, or have Mapo Tofu with Kirei Kotomine, all based on your in-game choices. Each route is completely valid relative to itself. The benefit here is that fans can play with causality, pursuing a narrative that best fits their preferences. Vicariously through Shiro, you can romance either Saber, Rin, or Sakura, and experience a version of the story catered to your decision. As a player, you can experience all of them without being a harem master, as each romance is delegated to its own timeline. This kind of thing hits us right in the psyche, because we've all likely pondered what our lives would be like had we made different choices, and visual novels let us pursue that curiosity in a safe environment. An iconic example of this type of multiverse can be seen with the anime Code Geass. This is a show that has a very distinct and resolute ending. Our protagonist, Lelouch, winds up sacrificing himself in the name of world peace, uniting the world in hatred of him so that he could be defeated by Zero. While tragic, this sacrifice had meaning because, presumably, the world did become a more peaceful place after his Zero Requiem had been completed. Despite this definitive ending, Code Geass was popular enough that a sequel was put into production, a sequel we now know is the movie Lelouch of the Resurrection. The idea of this sequel posed a problem, sadly, because if Lelouch were to be brought back to life, it may undermine his previous sacrifice. Even worse, a new story means a new conflict. Adding another villain or more warfare implies that the peace Lelouch died for wasn't nearly as monumental as we'd thought. For some, these aspects would ruin Code Geass's beautiful ending, and I'm sure the creators were well aware of this. In an attempt to have their cake and eat it too, Studio Sunrise decided to leave the beloved TV show alone, and instead make a series of films that would serve as a new timeline for the series going forward. That way, there's a version of the story that follows the TV show, preserving its continuity for fans who appreciate its ending, while creating another universe where the story can go in other directions. Owning up to this, Sunrise took creative liberties over the original story to make a version where three major things happen that differ from the show. Shirley survives, Lelouch is indeed resurrected, and world peace is almost immediately disrupted by a new villain. This process of establishing another continuity is meant to satisfy fans who like the original, but also want to see more from their favorite characters. Does it succeed in that endeavor? Can we really appreciate both timelines relative to their own merits? I think so, but I'll admit it requires some mental gymnastics. After all, we can technically do this to any franchise with a sequel we don't like. Just treat the sequel as part of one timeline, while imagining there's still a timeline that ended where the original did. The only difference is that, for Code Geass, the creators are giving both timelines their blessing, rather than declaring their latest version to be canon. Thankfully, Fate Grand Order also does this exact same thing. At first, before I understood the continuity, I thought FGO was being written as a sequel to Stay Night, rather than an alternate possibility. Thus, hearing how in FGO the world comes to an end made me feel cheated because I thought it implied Shiro's reunion with Saber and Avalon and all the other happy endings of Stay Night were only a temporary happiness before everyone in the world got incinerated. That's not very romantic now, is it? Of course, that was my bad. In truth, FGO is just as much a spin-off as Aprilia or Apocrypha. Basically, Fate Stay Night occurs on timelines where Lev Liner kills himself to prevent Getia's plan. Establishing FGO's story as an alternate timeline allowed Type Moon to build their massive mobile story without undermining the stories that already existed in the Nasuverse. Multiverses also allow for a story to explore entirely different themes under a vast tonal contrast. A horror story, for instance, can be explored as a happy slice of life. Like, seriously, Higurashi, a series known for its paranoia and brutality, has a mobile game that's collaborating with the peaceful Clannad of all things. If that's not liberating, I don't know what is. Of course, Fate also does this brilliantly with its spin-off series, Carnival Phantasm and Emiya-san Shino Kyo no Gohan, which take the grim and bloody Holy Grail Wars and replace them with comedy and wholesome cooking. Characters who were once trying to kill each other can now hang out like it was nothing. The full gravity of this actually just hit me right now. Lancer, the guy who stabbed Shiro in the story proper, is now hanging out at Shiro's house making salmon. Rather than a character in a fighting game, he's DLC for a Fate-themed cooking mama. This opens the characters up to an entirely different perspective, letting us learn and appreciate things about them that we never would if the franchise were limited to a single genre, and we have Multiverses to thank for that. So far, though, all I've been talking about is how we can split different versions or interpretations of a story into their own universes. But if we want to take things up a notch, we've got to go over stories that actually incorporate the existence of alternate universes. The most common form of this that we see are crossovers, stories that gather characters from all sorts of other stories into a single narrative. Fighting games do this all the time, usually involving a very basic narrative excuse to gather the full roster. Like, an evil supervillain who can mess with dimensions, tries to take over not only their own world, but all of the worlds. And heroes from different franchises need to come together to save the multiverse. Generally, these are designed not to interfere with the individual stories themselves, allowing participants in the crossover to return home as though nothing had happened. This can be fun, for sure, but ultimately it's less of a story and more of an opportunity for fan service and cameos. What I'm much more excited to discuss are anime that take this concept much more seriously. Look at Wonder Egg Priority, for instance. Sadly, this anime ends on a really shitty cliffhanger, but everything leading up to that is solid. There's a part in the story where our main protagonist, Ai, encounters a version of herself from another world, a version that tragically gave up on life and committed suicide. Our world's Ai is tasked with protecting her other self, and during their brief time together, the deceased Ai gets to see how strong and dependable she could become had she made different choices in life. It's quite profound and, in my opinion, very uplifting. On a more depressing note, we have Tales of Xilia 2, a JRPG that involves our heroes trying to correct their timeline by resolving irregularities. The main character, Luger, travels alongside the adorable Elle, who, spoiler alert, turns out to be Luger's daughter from another world. The game has different endings depending on whether Luger chooses to sacrifice himself to save the world, or if he chooses to sacrifice Elle. At least that's how I remember it. In one ending, Luger lives and eventually meets the woman he marries. They have their child together, who is of course Elle from his world. The Elle who accompanies us throughout the game, and this new baby Elle, may be the same girl, but the fact that they come from different worlds and have completely different experiences essentially makes them unique. Neither Elle has more of a right to life than the other, which is why in a different ending, Luger sacrifices himself to save the Elle from another world. She lives on in Luger's place as a permanent resident of his world. The fact that these different selves cannot coexist peacefully gives the game a potent, bittersweet quality. One of my absolute favorite anime, Recreators, is based on the idea that when we create fictional characters, they truly do exist in their own universes. In the story, several popular anime characters wind up transported to our world, where they get to meet the people who invented them. It challenges our philosophy on creative works, making us examine the idea that when we put a fictional world through hardship and conflict, we're actually affecting the real lives of that world's residents. Depending on whether we meant our stories to be happy, inspiring, or just downright cruel, the characters we create might take serious issues with us, because to them, we're essentially their gods, and they have to endure whatever scenarios we come up with. Time travel stories also count as multiverses, as the process of going back in time and changing the past implies that there are multiple possibilities any one world can have. Steins Gate incorporates this concept in the form of world lines, which the universe can shift between whenever someone utilizes time travel. Much of its narrative drama comes from the idea that you should be careful what you wish for, as meddling with time can surely take its toll on those who remember what happened in other world lines. There's also the concept of attractor fields, which tend to force different world lines to converge on key events, as though they were controlled by destiny. The original work, a visual novel, features a handful of endings where the protagonist Okabe winds up with different girls. And while Makise Kurisu's ending is treated as the true ending, that's just mostly to imply that her route has the most work put into it. Another time travel anime, Re:Zero, also plays with the idea of multiple universes. Our protagonist, Subaru, has a unique ability that causes his consciousness to return to a previous point in time whenever he dies. This allows him to make new decisions in an attempt to avoid his demise, and he uses this power to try and establish a timeline for himself where nobody has to suffer. While noble, it's implied that every timeline in which he fails still exists as part of a multiverse, and his many brutal deaths still affect the people who have to live on in those worlds. At the very least, it makes him think twice before giving up on any given timeline by offing himself prematurely. Much to my dismay, the Final Fantasy VII Remake is trying to incorporate multiple worlds into its story. The entirety of the original FF7 is being framed as a timeline that our characters are now trying to break free from. On top of that, it seems they're introducing a world in which Zack, a character who classically dies, winds up living. As to how this world will interact with the main game is a total mystery at this point. So far, though, they haven't really done anything with the idea, other than trolling fans who wanted a more conventional remake. Thankfully, the game is just too good to hate. I mentioned Higurashi earlier for its mobile game, but the original work it's based on is a multiverse. Our protagonist Rika is stuck living the same period of time in Hinamizawa in a Groundhog Day fashion, except tragedy seems to befall the village no matter what she does. She continues to jump from world to world, hoping to find a timeline where her friends aren't massacred, and she can finally grow up, because damn, she's been doing this for well over 100 years. That's a long time to be covering up the truth with a cute "Meepa." While often just an excuse to mix fantasy with modern sensibilities, most isekai also count as multiverses. By nature, there's at least two universes, the one our hero comes from, and the one they wind up transported to. This is used to the best effect when we see a cultural contrast between the two worlds, such as seeing modern tech interacting with dragons and such. It's why I think Gate is one of the best isekai out there. And last, but certainly not least, we have Fate Grand Order itself. The story revolves around trying to resolve singularities, which are distortions of historical events. In them, different historical eras are thrown off course when new possibilities are introduced. My favorite example is the idea that there's a singularity based around Jeanne d'Arc coming back to life and taking revenge on the church that had her burned at the stake. Then we have characters like Arthur and Musashi, who have wandered from their own universes to ours. There are things like Quantum Time Lock, which establish the multiverse has rules on how it keeps track of all the different worlds, and the Lost Belts, the unfortunate victims of when the multiverse at large decides to prune the amount of alternate worlds that exist. Not only do these Lost Belts have the same appeal as singularities, letting us experience what-if scenarios across history, but they also provide a great deal of drama, as our heroes have to save their world by denying the existence of others. The biggest concern regarding these kinds of multiverses is that, by acknowledging so many different worlds, it's possible that the dramatic elements of any given timeline are spoiled by the others. For instance, can we really feel sad for a character's death if we can simply jump over to another world where they're just fine? Are the Grail Wars less intense when we consider the combatants could be casually hanging out and having a wholesome time? I mentioned before, but there's a bit of mental gymnastics involved. We have to appreciate any given timeline relative to itself, while also being open to the idea of rearranging things. If this can be done successfully, it can elevate any linear story into an exploration of concepts, letting us revisit the same ideas and characters under different contexts. Generally, I feel this works best when a story is designed from the ground up to incorporate multiple universes, rather than using existing stories as an excuse to toy with established canon. In the end, we're mainly just left with some questions to soak in. We have to ask things like, if Square Enix uses the Final Fantasy VII Remake to keep Aerith from dying, for instance, does that betray the emotional legacy her death once had? Just how much does canon even matter to a story? What factors make multiverses work, and what factors cause them to infuriate us? Honestly, I don't have all these answers, which is why I now concede to opening this discussion to you all in the comments. Perhaps, through our collective discourse, we can find some clarity. Thanks for watching!
If you enjoy this channel, help us grow by liking, commenting, sharing the video, subscribing to OtakuDaiKun, and
most of all, smashing that notification bell so you don't miss out on all of our anime discussion, lore, or Let's Play content.
You can support us directly through Patreon, Subscribestar, or our YouTube membership, all of which come with benefits like exclusive vids and early access.
As always,
celebrate your fandom!